Yeah, just before I introduce Anna properly, first of all, as I always said, my name is David Bolt. I'm Director of the Centre for Culture and Disability Studies, and this is the last of the seminars for this year, but it's by no means the last in this series. Hence the link with Carlton. We're carrying on this series in the next academic year, the series Disability Futurity. Just before I come to that more specific, I thought it would be nice to mention that the last time I sort of introduced Anna at one of these events, obviously Anna's contributed to the conference and so on over the years, but to give her own paper at a seminar was actually 10 years ago, pretty much to the day. I wish it was to the day, because that would be tidier, but not quite. It was the 1st of June in 2009. And I knew this, but I just had a little check this morning just to have a look who was there. I don't know exactly who was there on the day. I know that some of my colleagues were. But I just thought it was interesting because I looked at the list for the 2 seminars. And some of the names that came up were Dr. Sheen, for example. I don't know, is Ria here?
She's
not. She's not. Well, she might have been. And she was on that list. Irene Rose was doing a round table at the same event, which again is nice, because I saw Irene on the menu, as it were, rather than just on the list of people who attended. And then there was a speaker after lunch who was working on a postgraduate studies, it said, or something like that, by the name of Dr. Anna Bay. Oh no, not Dr. Anna Bay. Yeah. Sorry. Mistyping. So I just thought that was quite nice, because as I say, it's pretty much 10 years to the day, only it would have been one day. So I just wanted to share that with you. And incidentally, somebody else who was on the list attending, Pauline Eyre, who was here today. So again, I like that sort of stuff. And just one more detail about that. Professor Stuart Murray, that was his first day as a professor, and he gave the keynote on that day. So that was then, and this is now. So here we are looking more specifically at this series, Disability Futurity, that Dr. Bay is going to share her contribution to this. Obviously, one of the things we're circling around here is the idea of epistemology, which we know from Johnson and McCruer. Another thought is complex embodiment from Tobin Siebers. And this work that Dr. Bay has brought to the table chimes very much with that thinking, I suggest, and therefore fits perfectly with this Disability Futurity series. Dr. Bay's been with us a few years now as a member of the CCDS, and in that time she's, as I say, helped massively with the conference in many ways, including giving papers and so on. She's attended a lot of these events, the seminars. She's working on a special issue with an external colleague that is actually on the theme, on a related theme anyway, to what she's going to be talking about today. So that's a special issue of JLCDS that's on the cards. Another thing would be good to mention is many of us are quite familiar with that book, the Routledge Handbook of Disability Studies that Anna did a chapter in the original. I hope that she's revised that chapter for the second edition. Please say you have, otherwise this is embarrassing. So obviously that would be good to look forward to that contribution. And then just recently, those of you who get those emails from me know that I've shared with you a couple of Anna's recent publications, one in Altair, and obviously one in Disability and Society. So lots of good stuff coming from this colleague. So if we can just show you appreciation before we start.
Thanks so much, David. So I'm just going to start briefly with some access notes. So I have 2 printed copies of the paper if anyone needs that, and I have a large print copy if anyone needs that. So yeah, please feel free to take. And before I start as well, so I'm not counting this in my time. I'm just
getting set up. There we go.
Okay, hopefully this will be all right. So I just really want to thank David for this opportunity. Obviously, the seminar series means a lot to me, so it's a real privilege and an honor to be able to speak here today. and to have our colleagues in Cauldron as well, and Toronto, I think someone said. I just want to have a note of thanks for my colleagues as well. And I do want to say that, and I wrote this down because I want to say it right, but I want to say that even when things are difficult or hazy, I know that I'll always be able to count on your collegiality, commitment to social justice, and frankly, brilliance from all of you, really. So I'm really grateful for the forms of mutual support and encouragement that we enact and the conversations that we have in the department. And this has been really important for me because many times it's given me a sense of belonging. So I really appreciate this from all of you. So the paper that I'm delivering here today is based on one of the journal articles that I published recently, as David mentioned, in Disability and Society. So if anyone is interested to know more details, you can look at that. If you can't access it, I'll be happy to provide access to the article. So in this talk, I want to think about the role of embodied knowledge sorry, I just have to make sure that the slides. Okay, so I want to think about the role of embodied knowledge in the context of disability futurity. And I want to consider what it means to think about the knowledge gained and enacted by disabled people in a world where disability continues to be framed by dominant perspectives as only loss and only personal tragedy and only a problem. These aspects, as we know, continue to be overwhelmingly dominant and continue to reproduce themselves with ease in our society. So as disabled people, we constantly encounter this easiness of reproduction of these kinds of arguments, and we encounter these practically every day. And I wanted to start with an example of my last encounter with such kinds of examples, because it was only last week when I had to deal with a travel company that provides travel arrangements for my institution, and a person called to discuss arrangements after I sent an email with my requirements, where I mentioned that I'm a disabled person with mobility issues and I need a hotel room in a corridor that is accessible by lift so I don't have to use stairs. The person called me back because they were very worried and they wanted to know, quote, the severity of my disability. And when I explained again that I only needed a regular room but in the floor accessible by lift, the person then sent an email saying that there were no rooms left, no accessible rooms left in the hotel. And then I explained again that I actually didn't need what is traditionally called an accessible room, which would be a room with a wet room, because I only need a regular room, but I needed to be accessible by lift. So this took 4 or 5 emails and a phone conversation. And I wanted to use this example because I think this is kind of part of the problem that we face in terms of the dominant understanding of disability in our society. And obviously, this person is being influenced by particular ideas of disability, and it's not really their fault that they were thinking about the severity of my disability. But I want to argue that encounters like this are interesting to consider, and that disability studies must consider and pay close attention to aspects of embodied knowledge, because what happened in that sort of interaction was a sort of misencounter between my own understanding and expert knowledge of what I need, and that person's perception of what a disabled person needs. And really their inability to be able to listen to my own understandings of what I need. So I want to sort of think about how disability studies must now and in the future pay close attention to issues of embodied knowledge and its effects as well on disability ontology, because I think this story is about someone else's lack of ability to understand my own embodied experience, but also the consequences for this in my own ontological self, and the same for many other disabled people who have encounters like this every day. So I hope to provide a contribution to our understanding of knowledges and strategies developed by people living with chronic illnesses specifically, and this is based on empirical work that I've done in England and Portugal. So the talk has sort of three main parts. I'll mention briefly some of the debates in disability studies which have focused on embodiment and are important to recognize here. And then I'll argue that disabled people constantly have to negotiate codes about the body based on normative notions of the body that I term here normative corporality. And then I'll identify some key themes from the research that I did with people with chronic conditions. I'll discuss these, and then I'll argue that disabled people's knowledges can be conceptualized as subjugated knowledges. So over the years, disability studies has paid much needed attention to obviously mapping out and describing disabled people's societal experiences of disablism and locating the problem of disability in society where it is in reality. And here I want to argue that it's important work and that this work needs to be done and continue to be done because there's much to do yet in this regard, but that this work can also be complemented by understanding and describing the many ways in which disabled people develop expert strategies and knowledges, which I refer here as subjugated knowledges, following Foucault's idea of this, which I'll discuss more later. So these knowledges are not always recognized or identified by others as being important. And this is kind of part of the problem. They go unnoticed. But being able to identify and describe these types of knowledges, I think, is essential for disabled people, because disabled people are often perceived by society as being dependent, needy, or generally, again, a problem to be resolved. But in order to navigate a world that's not made for their body minds, a world that offers mostly barriers and lack of understanding, I think disabled people need to develop expert strategies, and they do develop these. And so I argue as well that these can be seen as a form of resistance from disabled people. So on the other hand, even though some strands in disability studies have not always wanted to look at the lived reality of the body, and there's a lot of tradition of discussion of this in disability studies, and this is obviously for a good reason, because it can deter from focusing on the real barriers in society. But I'd argue now that as a discipline, disability studies is mature enough to be willing to understand that disabled people's embodied experience is a rich and complex one. So focusing on the knowledges of disabled people that disabled people might develop through their body minds, I don't think that it means that designated as such, really, by a set of cultural practices such as industrialization and capitalism, and beliefs such as ableism that have deemed some bodies and abilities to be inferior to others, and as a consequence have really dislodged them from societal participation and contribution, and this is quite serious. So as a consequence, some of these bodies' abilities, such as using wheels instead of walking, signing instead of talking, have been constructed as inferior, or their access needs have simply been ignored, such as by architecture, and not considered an equally acceptable way to do things. So because these bodies have been constructed as inferior and lacking, the ways disabled people have related to their bodies have historically been seen as of little significance when compared to what has been constructed as the normative way to do something. Our society tends to place such a focus on walking, for instance, that wheeling around instead and the strategies employed to do this is often considered second-rate, or again, a problem that needs to be resolved. Additionally, many disabled people's views about impairment and embodiment have often been sidelined because, crucially, as we know, they were either locked away in institutions in rich countries like the UK, or living the most pauper of lives without access to resources in poor countries, even in poorer countries in Europe like my own country of Portugal. So, of course, this has meant that they didn't have access to education and public life, and that their experience of living with impairment was obviously a really bad experience. And of course, we know as well that the influence of the medical model as the authority voice on the experience of impairment was also firmly given to biomedicine and its allied professions. So really, disabled people haven't had a space to really explore their own understandings of embodiment. So I want to sort of shed a different light on issues of embodiment and impairment, but in a way that does not reiterate the disenfranchising arguments existed before the influence of disability studies. So again, whilst the focus on social barriers must remain absolutely at the crux of disability rights and disability studies, feminists in disability studies have argued for a while that there should be equally a place to exploring the body and impairment in a different way than what was previously the case. So key authors and activists such as Jenny Morris, Liz Crow, and many others have reminded us that considering impairment does not mean having to take on the non-disabled world's understanding of our bodies. So we can offer our own understandings, and I think this is really important. Susan Mendel has also argued that considering thoughts and feelings really matters because, again, the systems of domination can influence how people feel about themselves, and so consequently, paying attention to them is itself a political act. And Carol Thomas has also later argued that we need to understand bodies as being biosocial in character, so having this dual aspect. I think this is a key argument in thinking about the role of the body for disabled people. And I think this is, in a sense, a political project on its own, because it's about arguing that disabled people have the right to explore their own meanings of embodiment, and these don't have to be the same as the non-disabled world's interpretation. And this means, I think, as well, if we think about impairment as biosocial in character, that we can't address social, political, and cultural structures that surround disability without understanding their impact on individual bodies and how those individual bodies resist these structures. So, although debates concerning the role of the body and impairment as a political project were brought forth primarily by feminists, there's a long tradition of other people offering contributions to this debate. So there's people like Hughes and Patterson from a post-structuralist perspective as well, people like Corker and French. And of course, in cultural disability studies, there's a long tradition as well of challenging some of these ideas, as David said, people like Tobin Sievers or Robert McClure or Alison Kafer. So all these debates have offered, I think, important things to this understanding of the importance of bodies and impairment. At the same time, I think disability arts and culture have really helped explore some of the notions of impaired body and offer a different way of understanding bodies and minds. And again, I think these encounters with disability arts and culture have been really important to try to challenge some of the dominant ideas about impairment. So Bill Hughes has argued that in practice, disabled people have begun to take pride in their own bodies, and that in the last 20 years or so, these new ideas about impairment have been integrated in disability studies and have really helped shape the social model itself. So what could be the issue with only valuing certain types of knowledge of the self and the body? Well, Susan Wendell argues that the dismissal of disabled people's knowledges about impairment in the body is quite serious, because what it does is that it constitutes knowledge lost. So this knowledge is not shared with others to aid them on a similar journey. And because Western culture creates both idealized notions of the body and believes that the body is something we can control in its entirety, knowledges of the impaired body don't circulate and are not shared. And this has particular consequences for our culture, because then most people who encounter illness or impairment for the first time are often very ill-equipped to be able to deal with this experience, exactly because these knowledges don't circulate and are not shared. So I think this is an important thing to consider. And of course, some of these knowledges have been sidelined or not valued because, again, they constitute a non-normative way of understanding embodiment. So I give an example here that goes beyond disability, which is, for instance, the decade-long enforcement of right-hand writing for left-handed people and children in particular. Forcing children to speak orally and lip read, forcing people to wear prostheses that don't work for them. These are kind of all examples of how far we've been willing to go to police non-normative bodily practices for the sake, really, of nothing else than a sense of standardization and a false sense of normative corporality. So I think this is an important point to consider. So I want to offer here this concept of normative corporality, and I'm proposing here that this refers to the artificial and cultural constructions of rules relating to how corporality should be and how it should behave within an ableist system that privileges some bodies and abilities over others. And for me, the concept calls attention to how privileging only some kinds of bodies means that the knowledges and contributions of those bodies and abilities that are considered inferior and lacking are discarded and wasted. So if one moves through the world using wheels or a cane for navigation, I think one builds a set of knowledges which are different from those accumulated by people who walk. Walking people who are visual might need visual cues to get somewhere, whilst visually impaired people might be able to navigate the environment using a cane based on a mental map built from experience, or for instance using a technique called echolocation. And this is interesting because a recent scientific study has proven that echolocation, in terms of the way it operates for people, works as well as using visual cues. But I think the problem with this sort of prioritization of particular types of ways of doing things like walking is that not just that we value those more, but also that it is then presumed that this is the only way to do something or the right way to do something. And so we build these notions of what corporality should be whilst policing those who do differently. And so the point is that these notions kind of affect everyone, but they affect particularly disabled people in particular. So I'm turning now to the more empirical part of the paper, where I engage with some participants' accounts concerning the knowledges and strategies that they developed as people who live with chronic conditions. So this is based on empirical work that I conducted with people living with chronic illnesses in England and Portugal. And the research sought to find whether people felt that they experienced disablism, but also whether they developed any particular knowledges or strategies. So here I was working in particular with participants who identified as having fibromyalgia, ME, which is myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, and multiple sclerosis. One of the research questions focused particularly on finding these knowledges and strategies. And I received written and oral accounts from people and then followed up with people to ask more questions after. I'm not going to spend too much time with methodology here, but if you are curious or want to know more, please feel free to ask in the Q&A. So I'll explain some of the three main key themes that I've identified that have come up from the data. And I'm using here a more limited amount of data than I used in the paper for the sake of time. So the three main themes found in the data were interesting because they kind of called attention to how participants develop knowledges and strategies, but also how they have to negotiate this with other people. And the research demonstrated differences between Portugal and England in other aspects, such as access to benefits and state support, support in employment, etc. But in terms of these themes regarding knowledges and strategies, there were quite a lot of similarities between English and Portuguese participants. And I received accounts from both genders as well, but for this particular topic, I'm using participants who are all female. So the first theme that I identified is I called taking responsibility for their lives and well-being. I think this was one of the most important themes that came up in the data, and this really refers to participants indicating that they take such a lot of responsibility for their lives and for establishing a good standard of self-care, a good standard of well-being in their lives. So despite the fact that they're often fighting very difficult impairment effects and symptoms in these illnesses, these can go from extreme pain and fatigue to numbness of limbs, difficulty walking, etc. But participants really talked about how they continue to see what they can do to make their lives better and how they continue to try to find solutions for the kind of barriers that they face and how they continue to find strategies to make sure that they're being able to operate in a society that's not very welcoming of their bodies and minds. So this aspect is particularly well illustrated by Kathy's insight, and she's a British woman in her 40s who had been diagnosed with ME and chronic fatigue syndrome. So even though she mentioned that there were many aspects to her life that were challenging, she also wrote about always finding new ways and believing in her ability to keep moving forward. So she says, ME has taught me that I'm incredibly strong and that feelings, emotional, physical, etc. are not the most important thing in life. There's a well of resources deep within me that keep me going, though I have been suicidal at times. I mainly keep on top of it by thinking positive thoughts. I'll not give up trying to get well, and I'm sure that I will one day. Meanwhile, I stay optimistic most of the time. So, despite the admission of very difficult times, which is illustrated here by her mention of suicidal ideation, she also discusses how she has learned that the way she feels, either physically or emotionally, is not necessarily the main thing she focuses on, or really the most important thing for her. And I thought this was quite interesting because I think this seems to provide a recognition for her that there are a variety of different aspects to life, and that for her it's possible to enjoy life with impairment, limitations, and pain, or that it is possible to value other aspects of life. Her discussion regarding the vast number of resources she always finds within her, which allows her to continue, I think is also relevant to notice. This really illustrates well the immense strength demonstrated by many participants in the study. And I think it also demonstrates an ability to find ways to keep going despite difficult physical and emotional situations, which can be very draining for people who have these illnesses. A similar sense of purpose and drive was present in other narratives received. And for instance, Luisa, a Portuguese woman, wished to tell me in her narrative how she was able to leave behind what she described as an emotionally abusive relationship and was able to begin a new life. Other participants focused their accounts on their ability to value the days when they felt better and their ability to listen more to their bodies. I think this is also a very important part of the research where people really develop intricate relationships with their bodies and their minds, and they really start listening to what their body is telling them, which again is hard because I don't think that we live in a society where people are encouraged to do that. I think it's quite the opposite. So this is illustrated by another participant, Susan, who was a British woman in her 50s and who said, I need to try and value the better days and try not to overstretch myself. ME helps you value the basic things in life. Learn what your body is trying to tell you. Be grateful for those who understand your condition and try to educate those who don't. So this ability to be able to listen to their bodies and be more in tune with their body minds was stressed by many participants as a fundamental aspect that allows them to drive forward the changes that they try to implement. So I think this is a key strategy developed by participants that allow them to gain a new re-engagement with their bodies and lives. And this process, I think, is absolutely necessary in order to reorient the experience of illness in a world that is really not welcoming of this experience and that constantly makes people feel that they don't belong and that they are, again, a problem for others. So the other theme that I've identified I've called developing and enacting strategies. And this is really about the importance that participants placed in developing strategies that work for them. So some of these are very individual, but these strategies that they enact are not always visible or recognized by others, and I think this is important again to mention. So these strategies are very diverse, and they range from very simple things such as being able to adjust the furniture in the room so that it suits your body in the best way, to make life easier for you, to very complex strategies, such as changing their whole diet and their whole routine and their whole outlook on life. So participants reported developing these strategies in connection to several aspects of their lives, from aspects that pertain to their personal and home life to aspects that focused on how they manage their jobs and work environment. And many participants reported consciously saving energy by not bathing or showering very often, as exemplified here by Kathy. And she says, I don't wash or shower very often because it uses up so much energy. I only go out if it's absolutely necessary. it also uses up too much energy, and I'm forced to breathe in other people's fragrances, which make me ill, or even through a mask. I do fairly well at looking after myself daily, though it's terribly difficult. I have to treat myself with kid gloves. My home's a mess because I don't have energy to clean up and tidy all the time. I do a little when I can, and as long as I focus on the most important job of preparing, cooking, and eating healthy food, I feel that I'm coping. Sometimes I can't do that, and throughout the winter I didn't stick to a healthy eating diet, and my health has gotten worse, but I'm back on track now. So again, although this speaks to some of the severe effects experienced by people who live with these illnesses, which really cannot be underestimated, I think it also demonstrates that participants make conscious efforts around managing and spending their energy. And I wanted to use this example in particular of bathing or not bathing, because again, I think this is such a big part of our societal expectations, that this is something that people should do daily, sometimes twice a day, I don't know. But for someone like Kathy, prioritizing food preparation becomes quite essential to her day. And this is where she chooses to spend her energy, because she understands that food preparation and choices around this may impact how she feels. And this also means that she decides not to spend this energy cleaning and tidying up, because this kind of activity means dispensing quite a lot of energy and effort. And again, whilst most healthy people would consider bathing essential, for Kathy, this is an activity she cannot take for granted. She just can't take it for granted. And so the choices around energy consumption and saving, I think, for me, demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of how to manage these types of conditions. So I don't think that this is about laziness, as it's often argued by people, even medical professionals. I think this is about sophisticated choices where people choose to spend their energy and the consequences that this will have for their lives. So these aspects were very common in the narratives received and are further illustrated here by Teresa's account, which also focused on the importance of managing her energy in her personal life, so that she can have enough energy for her job. So Teresa, who's a Portuguese woman in her 30s, told me, I had to stop doing many things. I've reduced considerably my daily activities so that I can go to work every day. I don't go out, nor do I entertain people at night in my house, because then I can't sleep, and the next day I feel extremely tired, and my workday becomes torturous, she said. So this extract of Teresa's account provides, again, interesting insights into how energy must be carefully managed and directed to the most important tasks, but also in this case, energy is managed by anticipation. And again, I think for people who have this experience, this is something that they will know. But I think it's really important to describe that people manage energy by anticipation. And again, I think this is a sophisticated way of dealing with their embodiment. So Teresa won't entertain people, and she won't do certain things because she's prioritizing her job, which is important to her. And she knows that if she does certain things, she won't be able to then do her job as she wants. So I think these are important aspects to note, because I think they challenge current misconceptions about these illnesses. And often participants reported, being told by the people, family members, people that they work with, that they're just lazy, that they can't bother, etc. So I argue here that by making conscious and informed choices around management of energy, participants are really demonstrating a skilled ability to be in tune with their bodies and to make choices that favor their well-being. And again, just think how radical this is in a world that constantly tells us that we just need to sacrifice identifies, for certain things. So I also want to suggest further that these choices come as a result of careful consideration and planning, because participants report having to choose very carefully where they spend their energy. So the last theme that I've identified, I'm calling having to negotiate embodiment changes with others. And this relates to any changes that participants may feel necessary to implement or that they need to enact, and how these often have to be very carefully negotiated with others. Other people around them often continue to expect that those body minds will operate in the same manner that they did before. And again, this is a particular thing for people who live with chronic conditions, because they might have had previous bodies that were able to function, were able to have more energy, and now this has shifted. So this shift doesn't just have to happen for their own embodiment, but they have to negotiate those with people around them. So other people that surround people with chronic illnesses, they often continue to expect that their body minds will operate in the same manner they did before. So participants report there's often little recognition from others that things have changed for them, and that they need to adapt their lives to their new reality. And I think this aspect is interesting to consider, because our body minds have a collective existence as well as a personal one. And we constantly negotiate our body minds with others, and I think this happens whether we like it or not. So for people whose body minds are able to do a lot, this is perhaps less of an issue, less noticed. But for people my participants, this is a big issue because their energy levels are so limited. And so I think part of negotiating some of these things is also negotiating with others the barriers that are faced in the environment, because suddenly other people around don't notice that you can no longer do that thing, you can no longer use those stairs, or you can no longer do that fast walk that you did before. And they have to adapt to this as well. So the kind of one of the accounts I brought to illustrate this particular aspect is from Teresa again, who said, we used to travel to our family house in the countryside in Portugal, which is 3 hours away from where she lives. And this became very complicated for me because I was expected to clean the house on arrival, and it became impossible for me to go there. But my husband doesn't understand this. Rather, he claims that he understands, but refuses to accept the fact that I can no longer do these sorts of things. So in this particular example, even though she has now been diagnosed with a chronic condition which manifests with widespread chronic pain and fatigue, she reports to me that her husband still expects her to clean their vacation house as in previous instances. And of course there's a gender aspect here, which is manifested in this expectation that she as the wife should be cleaning the house and making the house ready for the family. And this is perhaps more prominent in the Portuguese narratives that I received. But there's also a lack of acknowledgement of her new circumstances. And so, in a certain sense, her body is not just her own, but she has to negotiate it with the expectations that others around have of her body. And such expectations are often framed by all sorts of misconceptions about people who have chronic illnesses. So participants often report that others have real difficulty understanding how these illnesses affect them and how their body minds have changed. And I brought an illustration here from what another participant said. And she said, other people's perceptions are generally an issue they don't understand. They only see you having a meal or coffee and say you look well. They don't realize you struggle to get out of bed, cook, or if you don't go out for a coffee, you would climb the walls at home. They don't see you lying in bed sometimes in a darkened room for hours on end. They don't know the isolation and depression and mind hallucinations that you struggle with. And again, I think this is a very important insight from this participant because, again, she's calling attention to how these sorts of perceptions operate and how these have to be negotiated with others. So these aspects, I think, call our attention to our culture's very binary understanding of illness and wellness. And it is often easy to interpret how someone looks or the fact that they may be out and about as a sign of them being well. Our cultural signifiers for illness are often illnesses such as cancer, which can often have visible side effects, and as Susan Sontag has argued, are also perceived as cultural signifiers of character. But nowadays, even such illnesses don't necessarily mean that the person will physically present as always being poorly. Therefore, the assumption that illness or someone's body-mind state should be immediately perceived from the outside is, I argue, part of these problematic cultural codes that sustain ableism. I think it's therefore really important that we begin to decode and analyze these codes because they're at the heart of our understanding of normalcy and disability. And so I think the participant in this account is really trying to talk about the difficulty of navigating a world that expects you to look ill or disabled if you claim to be so. So you have to perform it for other people. And this is a world that also expects you to be easily read from the outside. So I argue that the knowledges and strategies developed through the body are never just a personal thing, because even though they might be developed by a particular body, they constantly have to be negotiated with others around. So in the same way that impairment is biosocial in character, knowledges developed about the body are also biosocial because they're shaped and negotiated through cultural norms. Even if someone learns and decides to do something different when compared to before, this is a process that often has to be negotiated and accepted by others around. So I come to my conclusion now. So I argue that our understandings of the body are mostly influenced by our notions of normative corporality. So these artificial and cultural constructions of rules relating to how corporality should be and how it should behave. For instance, the fact that you should hold a painting brush with your hand and not your feet or your mouth. We value mostly the knowledge of bodies which are read by society as normative. Yet, as the participants have demonstrated in regards to the experience of chronic illness specifically, there's a wealth of knowledge and strategies people with chronic illnesses can develop, which demonstrate a sophisticated engagement with the body. But these knowledges go unacknowledged and are often very easily disregarded or not even noticed by others. I would suggest that the difficulties in talking about illness and expressing the needs of the ill or impaired body arise also from the policing practices ableism does of the knowledges of illnesses and impairment. And these practices are intimately allied with imperialist capitalist practices of which bodies count in relation to work and production. Western modernity has also imposed a number of binaries, health, illness, able, disabled, etc., that entail hierarchies and therefore shape particular patterns of thought. And again, these don't account for indeterminacies and most especially for any kind of vulnerability recognized in the human condition. So this points us, I think, to the direction of a hierarchy of knowledges. And this is a topic that's been approached in particular by Foucault and post-colonial thinkers. So I'm going to use some of that work here now as I conclude. So in his lecture, in 76, Foucault discusses the notion of subjugated knowledges as having two distinct meanings. So first, he identifies what he sees as an epistemological shift taking place in the last few years at the time of his lecture. So he identifies subjugated knowledges as existing within erudite knowledges as, quote, those blocks of historical knowledge which are present but disguised within the body of functionalist and systematizing theory, and which criticism, which obviously draws upon scholarship, has been able to reveal, end quote. But then he goes on to describe the other meaning of subjugated knowledge, which is the one I'm really interested here. So he defines these as, quote, a whole set of knowledges that have been disqualified as inadequate to their task or insufficiently elaborated, naive knowledges located low down in the hierarchy beneath the required level of cognition or scientificity. So within these, he explicitly includes, quote, even directly disqualified knowledges, such as that of the psychiatric patient or the ill person, the nurse, the doctor, parallel and marginal as they are to the knowledge of medicine, that of the delinquent, etc., unquote. So he further argues that it is through these and through their reappearance that criticism can perform its work. I think this is both a critique of the systematic systems of erudition that constitute academia, of which, of course, there are many, and its exclusions, but also a sign of the importance of the local popular knowledges in dislodging this primacy and exclusivity of academic knowledge. So for both these senses above, he's also clear that these subjugated knowledges have been concerned with historical knowledge of struggles, as he calls it. And so we could suggest, I think, that lay knowledges about illness and the body have been disqualified and marginalized due to the predominance of specialist scientific knowledge on the subject, as well as the focus on normative knowledges of the body. So we have therefore been unable to value and construct a solid body of knowledge related to the experience of illness, the body, impairment, and disability, as well as the interactions of these with the social world. Such knowledges have therefore been wasted, or as sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos argues, in relation to the effects of colonization in regards to knowledges of the South, these are knowledges wasted that cannot be recovered. So it could therefore be argued that what one may describe as the subjugated knowledges of disabled people have historically been subjected to a massive epistemicide, and I'm using Santos' term again here. So an erasure of valuable knowledge. Disabled people have effectively been discouraged to produce and pass on certain types of specific knowledge about our bodies and impairment that could be beneficial to others. So I want to argue then that valued epistemologies of the body become exclusively those that pertain to normative corporality, those that refer to normative bodies and their expectations. These are the epistemologies to which Western modernity ascribes value to, and in this case these are produced by science and biomedical discourse for the most part. This in turn has had tremendous consequences for disabled people everywhere, because only knowledges constructed within these parameters are in fact considered valid. In the same vein of thought, I would argue that subjugated knowledges of people who experience illness or impairment certainly seem to be policed and devalued by the codes of ableism and the codes that construct normalcy. And by policing here, I mean a particular mechanism that chastises or ridicules those who want to talk about such knowledges. This was a kind of interaction that also came through strongly in the data. So people being kind of ridiculed and not really believed when they want to enact particular things in a different way. So I think this contributes to the process of constructing disabled people as, quote, abnormal, undesirable, and worst of all, non-existent. And I think the production of disabled people as non-existence could be argued to exist as in something as simple as inaccessible architecture, or implied in the question regarding the severity of disability. And if all buildings tell a story, I think inaccessible buildings are constantly retelling a certain narrative that renders disabled people as non-existent, since they cater only for some kinds of people. And this extends, I think, to all areas of the social sphere. Even when disabled people's existence is acknowledged, it's often the case that we are constructed as either severely subhuman or simply victims that can only be redeemed through the specialized knowledge of biomedicine. Yet, as I've demonstrated here, participants in this study are extremely knowledgeable of their bodies and the limits of their bodies, and they reveal intricate knowledge of their body minds and how to manage them. So they develop this minutiae of bodily knowledge and strategy that sustains them in their interaction with both illness and society. And they therefore seem to benefit strongly from the knowledge they gain from their newly discovered bodies. So I propose that a new understanding of illness must come to the fore then, one which understands illness not only as a kind of loss, but also as a command of something important, a person's body mind. And this understanding, I think, is crucial when we compare it to the importance of established systems of knowledge such as biomedicine, which ascribe real literal expertise to the person. Thank you so much.